Hello everyone, ShintoBean here, and in this video I am going to be categorizing and analyzing every single warlord that is currently in the game. There are 33 of them as of March 2021. There's a lot to talk about, so strap yourselves in. So first of all, I'm going to be putting all of the warlords into different categories, and the two broadest categories are offense and defense. For offense, these are warlords that are able to increase your damage output either by dealing direct damage to enemy units or by increasing the attack capabilities of your units. On the other hand, defensive warlords either heal your units or debuff the enemy attack type, reducing that incoming damage. Now these are a little bit too general, so I'm going to further split these into subcategories. For offense, I've got 5 different categories: aggressive, escalating, combo, endgame, and attrition. Now these are just terms that I came up for the purposes of this video. There's not official terminology or anything, just FYI. For defense, it's a little more simple. We just got our healers and our protectors. So don't worry, I'm going to be going through and talking about all of these in detail, and we're going to start with offense, and we've got the aggressive aggro warlords here. These are the warlords that just go in and start beating things up, dealing a lot of damage really fast. The two most obvious options for these aggro warlords are Captain Badruk and Boss Zagstruck of the Orcs. Badruk is able to get extra attacks in whenever you destroy something with a ranged unit, and then Zagstruck, his special rule basically prevents you from readying, instead forcing you to go attack every single turn. So he's able to deal a lot of damage really quickly, especially if you have the Scout trait unlocked. Next we've got Grimnar. Now this guy has, at first glance, a pretty similar special rule to Badruk. It's kind of like a melee version, except it's not nearly as strong, in my opinion. I think with Badruk you are able to consistently deal a set 60% of your damage, whereas Grimnar, it kind of depends on the situation. You can deal anywhere from 1 to 99% of your current melee attack value. It's just not quite as reliable as Badruk. Then we've got Skulltaker and Ulthakar. These two warlords are able to increase the deadliness of your units depending on how much health your enemy units have remaining. For Skulltaker, if the unit is at 25 or low health when it takes melee damage, it is immediately decapitated and destroyed. For Ulthakar, if the enemy units are at 75% health or lower, it greatly increases the damage output of your units. And then finally, we've got Nemesor Zandrek. This guy, it was kind of hard to place this guy, but I'm just going to put him in aggressive. He randomly increases the damage of your ranged or melee by 15%. I like to use powerful units with him, going for a very aggressive build. So out of all of these warlords, I would say the strongest options are definitely Badruk and Zagstruck. They have very good special rules that are quite easy to use. I do enjoy using Skulltaker and Ulthakar. They're a lot of fun, even if they're not quite as strong as Badruk and Zagstruck. And then Nemesor Zandrek is also a pretty fun option as well. Okay, moving on to escalating. This refers to warlords that are able to increase the damage output of their units gradually over the course of the match. So the first two, we've got Gosar and Zephyrblade. Gosar increases the melee attack of all of the units in your army by +2 at the end of each turn, so just steadily increases throughout the match. And then the Zephyrblade increases the ranged output by +3 every time any card is destroyed. It's a very predictable, reliable way to increase your damage output. Next up we've got Tolmaron and Voldis. These two function in a pretty similar fashion. Tolmaron increases the ranged output whenever you deploy a Space Marine, and then Voldis does the same thing except for Psykers. These two are also very strong options, and you have a lot of control over which units get the buffs, so they are pretty solid. And then we've got Aunva. This guy is a little bit unique. He increases your damage output, but based on the damage that your units are taking from either ranged or melee attacks. So out of these guys, I think Tolmaron is probably the strongest option. I think he's good for lower level players as well, because Space Marines have so many different ranged units. With Grandmaster Voldus it's a little harder, I think, because Psychers tend to be a little more expensive, so you can't have as many bodyguards, and also some of the best Space Marine Psychers are legendary, so they're just harder to get copies of. I do also enjoy playing as Zephyrblade. I think he's a pretty solid one for lower ranking players, I think. Onva is also quite fun, but his major drawback is that his special rule does not do anything against Psychers, which is a pretty significant weakness. Moving on to combo. These warlords make use of traits or different bodyguard interactions to increase their damage output. So I've included Lilith and Snickrot. Lilith is able to redeploy her units constantly and reuse traits over and over to increase the efficiency of her units. With Boss Snickrot, he's able to make use of certain traits like Target Acquired, most notably, to greatly increase his damage output to different lanes. Then I'm including these three together: Commissar Yarrick, Canoness Viridian, and the Avatar of Cain. I think all three of these work the best if you combine powerful units with very weak fodder units. And if you let the weak ones die quickly, then they will empower your stronger units to let them deal a lot more damage than they normally would. Now, Canoness Viridian's special rule is quite strong as long as you position your units correctly, and then the Avatar is also particularly strong this season thanks to the Deathblow trait. The other three warlords are quite fun to use. Lilith and Snickrot are really good for more advanced players who have all of their traits unlocked and who like just playing around with strategy and positioning. And then Yarrick is a little more beginner friendly, but I think he's still a solid warlord. I like using a ranged composition with him. Okay, moving on to the endgame warlords. These are warlords that have the biggest impact when they hit the field. So the first two, we've got for Tau our Commander Shadowsun and Commander Farsight. These both function in a similar fashion. Once you deploy your last unit, it will heal everything that you have on the field to max health and greatly increase your damage output. For Shadowsun it's ranged, and for Farsight it gives you a huge melee buff. They're both solid choices. And then we've got Abaddon and Ghazghkull Thraka, two very strong warlords, who Abaddon increases the attack power of all of your remaining units every time he makes an attack, and Ghazghkull Thraka just has one of the strongest melee attacks in the game, good for bashing enemies into the ground. And then finally we've got Eldrad here, who I've included mainly because he has a pretty weak special rule that is not very reliable. It can increase the damage output of your Psychers throughout the match, but you can't really count on that. But he is one of the strongest Psychers. Once he deploys to the field, he can deal lots of damage himself. Out of these guys, I think Shadowsun and Farsight are pretty solid options, although Tau, I think recently are not very popular as a faction because of their kind of boring playstyle. The other three warlords are pretty good as long as you have the warlord itself at a high level, because they are one of the main damage dealers in the deck. If they're at a low level, they just are not very effective. Okay, and then finally, the final subcategory for the offense is attrition. These are warlords that just deal damage directly to the enemy units through their special rule. First off, we've got Artemis and the Hive Tyrant. With Watch Captain Artemis, every time you deploy a Space Marine, it will deal percentage-based damage to a random enemy. It can be good for taking out high health targets, but it's less effective against swarm type decks with lots of bodyguards. The Hive Tyrant just does a set 15 damage at the end of each turn. Then we've got Ahriman. This guy switches between damaging enemies or healing your own units. That's an interesting special rule. He's also a powerful Psyker with a strong endgame potential. And then finally we've got the Necron Stormlord Imhotep, who is pretty unique in that you have to actively ready your units in order to make use of his special rule, which deals 20 damage to a random enemy. It can have the potential to be quite powerful, and he was one of the strongest warlords, I think, back in the day. Not so sure these days, but I think he's still a solid option. The other two I'm not particularly fond of. Artemis, I just don't think he performs quite as well as Lieutenant Tolmaron, and the Hive Tyrant is a strong warlord itself, but finding good bodyguards to synergize with it is another issue. Alright, moving on to the defensive warlords. First off, we've got our healers who can just increase the health of your units. First off, we have Rakarth and Magos Dominus. Rakarth increases the health of all of your units by +7 whenever anything dies, so it's a very reliable, good way of just increasing the overall health of your army. Magos Dominus increases the health of whatever is remaining on the field whenever you lose a unit, and that is by 20 health. Then we've got the Corpse Lord, who increases the health of your units that ready. And this guy, I mean, he has kind of a passive playstyle, which I don't particularly enjoy. And then we got Captain Acheron, who is, I believe, the first warlord that players start off with in this game, and he also happens to have the most boring special rule, which only increases his own health. Out of these guys, I would say that Rakarth is probably the strongest one, and he's also pretty easier to use, pretty beginner friendly. I do also enjoy using Magos Dominus. I think the bodyguards with the Endless trait pair well with him, so he is an interesting option. And then we've got our Protectors. These guys mainly reduce the incoming damage in various ways. We've got Gloggerthrox the Foul and the Swarmlord. Gloggerthrox is able to target specific enemy units, reducing their damage, and then the Swarmlord fires just a general debuff at the end of each enemy turn. And then we've also got the Tervagon, which I've included in here because it's able to spawn an infinite supply of Termagants, which you can use to block an enemy lane, absorb lots of damage from the stronger enemies. Now, in my opinion, none of these warlords are actually very fun to play as. I think they are interesting concepts, particularly the Tervagon is quite fun. It's a fun idea, but it has a very slow play style, which I just do not really enjoy. And then finally, we've got Greyfax, who just doesn't really fit into any of the categories. She is just entirely dependent on which bodyguards you decide to use with her, but that's what makes her interesting, and I think there are just so many possibilities that she's a pretty fun one to play as, even though she did get a pretty big nerf this season. So there you have it. In conclusion, these are all of the warlords in the game on one single page. We've got the offense on the left side, the defense on the right, and then Greyfax there at the bottom. Lots of different possibilities, lots of variety, which is, I think, really good. Some warlords are definitely better than others, but I think at the end of the day it really just comes down to what level each of your warlords is at, and the level of your bodyguards as well, and finding a composition that synergizes well with each warlord. And sometimes, you know, I'll take a less popular warlord and play a game or two as with it. It's you know, just for a change of pace. It's kind of a good way to keep things feeling fresh as well. So that's it from me. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, and I will see you next time.